Hi everybody, thanks for listening. I'd like to talk about a particularly special one of the few today, who I knew extremely well, Warrant Officer Peter Hutton Fox. And Peter was a really extraordinary chap. He had such a wicked sense of humour. But let's just tell his story, and I'll tell you why Peter Fox really ended up being unique amongst the few, in fact, which was probably the last thing you would have expected. But Peter was born 23rd of January 1921 at Bridlington in Yorkshire. His father, Fred, was a seed crusher's salesman, and Peter joined the RAFVR in June 1939, learnt to fly at Kidlington. Then he was mobilised along with the rest of the country on the 1st of September 1939, did his square bashing at No. 1 Initial Training Wing, Cambridge, where also in his intake was Johnny Johnson, who was also a sergeant then, who ended up, of course, being the official top-scoring RAF pilot of the Second World War. So after square bashing and initial flying training, it's off to Yatesbury and Montrose for service and advanced service flying training. And then there was a bit of a thing, the Three Musketeers. There was Peter Fox, Dennis Nichols, and Ken Wilkinson, all of whom flew fighters ultimately in the Battle of Britain. And this is now, I shall quote Peter's own words. He says, "I was a Sprog pilot as Dennis Nichols and I joined 56th Squadron at Boscombe Down from 5 Operational Training Unit, Aston Down, on the 17th of September 1940. And I think it was the day after joining that he and I acted as coffin bearers to a pilot of 56th Squadron killed in action. We were just also-rans, having become operational late in the Battle of Britain." Now, I love that, also-rans. And Peter always described himself as one of the also-rans. But it's the also-rans that have always inspired me and interested me so much, because whereas many of the famous pilots have had the opportunity to write and publish their autobiographies, their memoirs, or have books written about them, the majority of the also-rans, in inverted commas, went home after the war, put away their medals and logbooks and photographs and memorabilia in a shoebox and stuck it up in the attic, and had other things to get on with, other careers to run, families to feed, and so on and so forth. And the war kind of got put away. So when I came on the scene in the late 1970s or 1980-ish, the few had retired then. So suddenly they got time to sit and talk and think about the past. And it was all about timing. And this is when I was talking to Peter. So he went on, he says, on the 20th of September 1940, in Hurricane GNI, I was flying for an hour and a half on a height test, and I've entered in my logbook 32,800 feet. I remember well the way I had to fight in nursing the Hurricane up the last few hundred feet and kept falling out of the sky in stalls. I remember that a Polish pilot was lost, as he and I were both weaving as tail-end Charlies, and I did not even see him hit." So he continues, "Saga. I was 19 years old. I had flown Hurricanes for 20 hours and just didn't believe it when I saw the enemy, which I understood to be a 60-plus raid of Heinkels and fighter escorts of Me-109s and Me-110s. Now, this was the raid on, aimed at Westland Aircraft Factory at Yeovil by Kampfgeschwader 55, with its escort of Me-109s from JG2 and Me-110s from JG26. Unfortunately, well, or fortunately, depending which way you look at it, cloud covered the target, and through a hole in the cloud, the German bomb aimers saw Sherborne, which had no military significance, just a few miles away from Yeovil, and absolutely devastated the town centre by mistaking Sherborne for Yeovil and Westland Aircraft. So it was all a bit of a tragedy. And in fact, the Germans broadcast an apology about having mistakenly bombed Sherborne, which is quite extraordinary. But this is the raid we're talking about. So Peter continues. He says, I had never seen so many aircraft together, and as far as I knew, we of 56 Squadron would be attacking the bombers. I doubt if we were up to the full squadron strength of 12, and a Spitfire squadron would be engaging the enemy fighters. Tally-ho! I do know my mouth felt very dirty tasting with apprehension. We gained height going out to sea, and then curved down and round and in to attack the Heinkels, which were going towards the English coastline. One or more of ours went in to attack the leaders of the enemy and others to the rear. I selected one at the rear, pressed the button, and aimed firstly at one engine, then sprayed across to the other. I did not see any return fire from the gunner, but suddenly the Heinkels seemed to slow down and slowly peel off to port. I started to follow him down, still firing, when there was an explosion, and I saw that there was little left of my instrument panel. I've been advised by an old-timer to fly with my hood open when in full action, as bullets could damage the hood so it wouldn't open. Luckily, on this day, I had followed that advice. Otherwise, my head would have been blown off as the shell hit the canopy. I peeled off starboard, pulling upwards and away, with all controls seemingly working correctly. I got over land at 3,000 feet and was wondering whether I could make the coastal airfield at Warmwell near Weymouth when I saw flames coming up between my legs. I don't think that I even thought about my next action, which was to instinctively roll the kite upside down and release my harness. I then saw my feet still above me and the hurricane above my feet, presumably stalled. Where was the ripcord? I told myself to calm down and pulled the D-ring straight away. I had never before pulled a ripcord, never seen one pulled, never seen a parachute packed, and never had any parachute instruction. The D-ring was flung into the air, followed by some wire. Obviously, I'd broken it. I then felt the tug of the pilot's chute, followed almost immediately by the wrench of the main parachute. I was safe. The next second, I was aware of an enemy, which I assumed was going to shoot me. It was, however, my flaming hurricane, which literally missed me by inches. The kite slowly screwed round, going into a steeper and steeper dive until almost vertical, aimed directly at the cross hedges of 4 fields to the northeast of a wood towards which I was now drifting. The aircraft hit the cross hedges spot on. A short pause, then a huge explosion, followed by another pause before flames shot up to a great height. I'm glad I wasn't in it. I was safe again, but didn't feel it, as the sea looked rather close, and I didn't want to end up swimming. I then recalled a film about a German parachutist, which had shown how if you pulled the parachute lines on one side or the other, the direction was slipped off accordingly. I tried, but which side I don't know, as I could not see which way I was drifting. I certainly couldn't think aerodynamically at that moment. Leave well alone, I thought. I was safe again. Then, blood trickling down my right leg. I tried to lift my right leg to see, but couldn't. I'd met aircrew who had lost limbs, but could still feel extremities that were no longer there. My leg must have been shot off, and would crumble beneath me upon landing. I was getting close to the ground and worrying about my shot-off leg, when I remembered the story of a pilot being shot in the foot by the Home Guard. "British!" I shouted at the top of my voice. I pulled hard as my parachute clipped a tree on the edge of a wood. Upon landing, I just fell over gently, when the wind pulled the chute sideways and I shouted, "British!" again. As no one came, I started to roll up my parachute when a farm labourer climbed over a nearby fence and requested confirmation that I was okay. My shot-off leg was not, in fact, shot off. It was just a tiny wound on my knee where a small piece of shrapnel had entered, and another the same size also half an inch away where it had come out. A lady on horseback then came along, and I draped my parachute over the animal. Off we went on foot until a van took me to Lyme Regis police station. I was then entertained in the local pub whilst I awaited transport back to Warmwell. someone from Air Sea Rescue arrived, and I told him that I was pretty sure that my Heinkel had gone into the drink. Now, Peter's Hurricane N2434, coded USH, actually crashed at 16:30 hours, 800 yards north of the Wootton-Fitzpaine to Moncton Wild Road at Wootton-Fitzpaine, near Lyme Regis on the Dorset coast. Now, there's no doubt that Peter had been hit by 20mm cannon fire from an Escortium 109 or 110, and after recuperating, Peter returned to 56 Squadron, later joining 234 Squadron flying Spitfires at Warmwell during the non-stop offensive of 1941. Now, what happened next, Peter also described. He says it was not long after the CO of 234 Squadron, Squadron Leader H.M. Stephen DSO, told me he would hold back his recommendation for my commission by 2 weeks, because in a fortnight my flight sergeant's crown would be due, meaning that if I was commissioned thereafter, I would be a flying, not pilot officer. It was then that things started to go wrong. The prospect of a commission was about time. I had first missed being commissioned at number 1 ITW Cambridge due to a posting. Then at 8 FTS Montrose, a post with telephone wires interfered with the process. That was a low-flying problem. And then in 1940, while serving with 56 Squadron at Boscombe Down, I was flown into a haystack. One may think that a haystack would be soft enough, but it was 3.5 days later that I woke up again with a broken back. Meanwhile, the commission passed by again. However, it was a lovely morning on 20th of October 1941 at Warnwell Airfield in Dorset, and everything seemed to be going well. My back had mended, I was 20 years of age, my commission was on the boil again, and I was poised to go home to Oxford on leave. In one pocket of my best uniform was a signed leave pass, and in another a snapshot of some of the pilots, including myself, standing around the squadron transport with 234 painted on the windscreen. My parents would have been interested to see it in a few hours' time after I'd flown to Kidlington in the Station Magister. I was also intending to show my parents the identity disc with Rissole on one side and 234 Squadron Flight Lieutenant Mortimer Rose on the reverse. My flight commander, Morty, had only recently given me the dog. There was also my invention. I had drilled a small hole in the lever of the CO2 bottle, which, when pulled, inflated the Mae West. A piece of cord was then passed through the hole and was tied with a bow to the buoyancy cushion, which, on top of the parachute, formed a seat for the pilot. This would give automatic inflation of the Mae West, whether or not the pilot was conscious, having bailed out over the drink. It was just necessary to remember to untie the bow before getting out of the plane at base. It was lunchtime, and the squadron was about to be stood down. "It won't count off your leave," was the CO's response to me volunteering for a Newson race over France. Sergeant Sapsed volunteered as my number 2. The sortie was to locate and blow up an ammunition dump sited just inland and to the east of Cherbourg. Another volunteer pair were to strafe an aerodrome to the west of Cherbourg. Wind blowing from the west, so a course was calculated from Portland Bill to a bay east of Cherbourg. All 4 Spitfire Mark 5Bs, each armed with 2 20mm cannon and 4 machine guns, were ready to go. Take off on Warnwell's grass runway with wind from the west meant taxiing away from dispersal the full length of the aerodrome and then turning into wind. I applied my brakes to turn into wind for takeoff at a tyre burst. Undo harness, undo bow to CO2 bottle and out, run the length of the aerodrome and into another Spitfire, AZH AD203, in place of AZC AD726, which I usually flew and which was now standing empty at the far end of the airfield with a burst tyre. No revolver or very pistol in the pocket of the new Spitfire. Over Portland Bill, course set and no sign of the other pair, just Sappy Sapsed following me, flying just above sea level across the channel. What appears to be the correctly shaped bay appears in just under half an hour, cross the coastline, and what seems to be a single machine gun opens up, a thud, and the oil pressure gauge drops to 0. I tell Sappy over the RT I've had it, but the RT doesn't work, probably damaged by the same bullet. No revolver or very pistol with which to destroy the Spitfire, so must turn back to sea to dump it, hoping to then swim back to land. Engine now objecting to running without oil, and sounding very rough. I fired a short burst of my guns in anger, until I noted the poor cows scattering in the field ahead. Coast in sight, engine stops, speed drops, and I hit a telegraph pole with one wing. The aircraft slews around and gently tips on its nose and then settles back. Quite a gentle crash, really. Must try and escape. Undo harness, jump up blows Maze West, can't get out. Bags of fumbling, a great raspberry as the May West pressure drops. Out I get, run across a couple of fields, and dive under a hedge where the cover is good and thick. I was in the hedge quite deep at the junction of hedgerows and had time to take off my May West, undo my escape kit, take off right shoe and sock, and place money, maps and compass under the instep before replacing sock and shoe. Voices came closer. A male French voice shouts, "Come out, boy, he see you or he shoot." 2 shots rang out, although I don't know whether fired into the hedge or into the air. After some quick thinking, I decide that discretion is the better part of valour and crawl out, hands up, to face a small crowd of civilians and a German soldier armed with a rifle on the farther side of a fence to another field. May West thrown over fence, 2 hands on top of fence, a great leap, and I'm in their field. I well remember the civilians' applause for my athletic prowess. In an endeavour to convey my sadness at not being able to destroy my plane, and my knowledge of the German language being schoolboyish in the extreme, I point to my Spitfire, klaxon blaring, in the centre of the adjacent field. I place my hand on the German's rifle. Our conversation in German must have been absorbing because he let go of it. A moment later, a couple of German officers appeared. One slapped the soldier's face, snatched the rifle from me, and returned it to the soldier. Life returned to normal. Salutes having been exchanged, we walked across the field to a road. There a soldier ran out of a building to take my photograph. I will never know why on earth I raised my arm over my face to prevent the photograph being taken, as such a photograph could have been used to show an ashamed Terrorflieger. Then we went off to Maupertus airfield near Cherbourg, where I met some Me-109 pilots of 1 and 2 Jägerschwader 2. Most of them spoke English, but I considered it wise not to tell them that on the 26th of August 1941, my squadron had strafed this airfield. I had blown up a petrol Bowser. We enjoyed considerably good-humoured banter, but they wouldn't let me fly a 109 to formulate a comparison. Whilst playing table tennis with one of the pilots, a very different kind of uniformed officer abruptly stopped the game, and it was a hard bed in a small cell for me for the rest of the night. So, for Flight Sergeant Fox, there followed the rest of the war in captivity, all of which is another story. But Peter also summarised that, saying 5 main POW camps plus 3 working party camps, and 3.5 years later elapsed before I was home again in England and able to read in my logbook the entry 20th of October 1941, Spitfire H-203 missing, shot down by flak over Maziari. I never did get that commission. I left the RAF in 1946 as a warrant officer and later became a surveyor. Now, before leaving the service, Peter met Beryl, who was a WAF, serving at RAF Cosford, and the couple married, had children, and retired happily to Weston-super-Mare in the West Country. So, in 1994, when I was about to bring out a book called Angriff Westland, which was about these raids on the West Country, and I'd contacted Peter, we took Peter back to his crash site and recovered the remains of his Hurricane, which, of course, were in 1 million pieces. But the unique thing about this is, firstly, that Hans-Peter Wolf came with us, who was a former German pilot and a great friend of ours, Peter had flown Heinkel 111s at Stalingrad and then converted to fighters, flying Me-410s and Focke-Wulf 190s against the American daylight offensive until he was shot down by a Tempest and captured on Operation Bodenplatte, New Year's Day 1945, the Luftwaffe's last offensive. So Peter Wolf joined us, so that was Hans, and we had the Fox, Peter Fox, and Peter Wolf, the Wolf, the Fox and the Wolf, and that always tickled Peter. So we all went back to this crash site, and I'd taken out a recovery licence with the Ministry of Defence to recover the aircraft, and I took it out in Peter's name as a member of our former Malvern Spitfire team. So when the parts were recovered and they were conserved by Dennis Williams, and we had them professionally mounted for presentation to Peter, the point was that you have to submit a returns form to the Ministry of Defence detailing what's been recovered so that they can then transfer right of ownership from the Crown to the licence holder. So consequently, Peter Fox became the only one of the few to ever own his own Battle of Britain aircraft, even though it was in a million pieces. I think that's great, personally. I'm so pleased we did that. Peter thoroughly enjoyed our friendship and communications and the events that he attended, and indeed nobody was more enthusiastic during the hurricane recovery than Peter himself. So it was a wonderful thing, and he was just such a great man, who I think died in 2005. And at his funeral, 56 Squadron were then flying Tornadoes and sent a tornado over, which beat up the church and went up vertically at such speed and such great noise that it set all the car alarms off, and Peter would have loved that. So that's the story of Peter Fox, wonderful man, and thank you for listening. I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. We've got loads and loads of stuff coming, whether that's going to be videos, podcasts, shorts, absolutely loads of stuff. So wonderful, and thank you very much indeed for listening.